Hey guys, welcome back to the new video in the tutorial series Introduction to Kubernetes. Today we are going to talk about ConfigMap. A little bit about me. I am JainishShah software developer. These are the links which you can use to follow me on GitHub, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Let's get started. So what is ConfigMap? ConfigMap is a way to bind configuration files or a command line argument or any environment variable to running a container inside the pod, and it can be mapped at runtime by Kubernetes. Now, you know what, how it helps? It helps you to separate your configuration from your pod, and you can easily manage your workload in a portable way. Right now, config map can be stored to use non-sensitive or unencrypted data. Uh, for sensitive data, there is another object type secret. In the next video, we'll learn about that. So let's understand how config map works. So when you deploy a pod, right, on the node using APIs, on parallel to pod, you can create config map which you can bind to as a volume or mount as a volume to your pod at runtime. Now, if something happens to your pod, if your pod is either killed or recreated or restarted, then you won't lose your configuration because you are externally attaching it as a config map. So let's learn how we can do that. Let's create our own config map. So I have created example on my GitHub repo, Introduction to Kubernetes. If you go to this link, there is a folder called config map. Inside that, I have created all the files. So in my case, I have already checked out that repo, and you can see all files are available. So let's start with creating our first config map. So I will just use kubectl apply -f with config map literal, and at the same time I will create the config map. Now you can create config map in a two-way. One is using literal or using file. Let me quickly show you how the config map object definition looks like. So kind will be config map, and you will pass the data in a key value pair if you are creating a config map of literal. So which is this. In our case, I'm using name, and the value is my name. You can also create config map out of file. So here I'm creating a file called index.html with this content. And we are passing this to config map at the runtime, or we are mounting those to pod container running in that pod. The pod is of Nginx. So I'm mounting a volume, and I'm passing the config map name in the volume, and then in the volume mounts inside the container, I'm specifying that it should put that file or write that file in this mount path, right? And the key literal, so I will be setting an environment variable name author, and author will be and I'm setting value of the config map which I created from literal. I'm setting the value of keyword name as a value for this environment variable. So let's go ahead and create the deployment. And I have also created the service to expose the service. So now if I do kubectl get all, I will see that the Nginx service is created, Nginx deployment is created, still in the process to get started. ReplicaSet is created. If I do kubectl get config map, you will see that two config map are created. Now you can do kubectl describe config map and name of that config map to see the value, right? Value will be available as it's a config map, but for secret, you will see the value are being encrypted. Now let's see the other config map, the static content, and you can see the index.html page with its value. I already have enabled the Kubernetes dashboard as well. So you can see the config map from dashboard as well. You can even modify those. So this is my config map for static content, and then other for the values. So let's see if my pod is running, and you can see my pod is running. It's healthy. So let me run the command to get the pod IPs to access this service. And this is the IP address that I got out of running those two commands along with the port. And you can see that the Nginx is running, and it's displaying the content that we are passing from index.html file as a config map. Also, let's do another thing. I will do get pod. Let's exec into the pod. We are inside the pod. Now if I do echo dollar author, which is I'm trying to read the author name, it is displaying value of the value that we are passing from config map JainishShah. This is how you can use config map mounted to inside the container, right? And the advantage of this is that you can change the value or change the configuration independently without affecting your pods. That makes the scaling easy. So for example, let's say if you just have one container or one Docker image, you want to run it across the different environment, be it development, QA, or pre-production or production. Now each will have different configuration depending on the environment. And instead of creating separate Docker image for each, you will pass config map at a runtime, which makes it very easy to maintain those load. So that's about it for config map. If you have any question, feel free to add your question in the comment. I will try to answer those. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.